The demise of a ruler can be the first in a stack of dominoes, which, when pushed, can have geopolitical consequences that echo down the centuries to the present day. One such ruler will fall on this day, 21st of August 1246, in a battle that rages on the banks of the Leiter River. Duke Frederick II Babenberg of Austria, known as the Quarrelsome, has invaded Hungary in yet another border conflict with King Bela IV. The long-standing dispute between the two men will be resolved for good. Although they are more numerous, the Hungarians are unable to ward off the invaders, and before long their will to fight breaks. The king's army routs completely. The defeated Bela retreats east towards the Danube to regroup. But what he doesn't yet know is that the Duke of Austria has fallen during the pursuit of the fleeing Hungarian army, and whatever designs he had on Hungary died with him. Without a male heir, Frederick II was the fifth and last Duke of Austria from the House of Babenberg. His death sparked a power grab that would reshape the history of Central Europe. Having inadvertently caused the extinction of the ruling Babenberg dynasty, Bela understands that the contest over the ceased imperial fiefs of Austria and Styria is an excellent opportunity to expand his influence. But in 1246, he lacks the strength to intervene. His kingdom still suffers from the devastation of the Mongol invasion of 1241, just 5 years earlier. Around half of the population he ruled over east of the Danube has perished, and much of the kingdom still lies in ruins. Complicating matters is that throughout the 1240s, many European rulers, including Bela, fear that a second major Mongol attack will come. Thus, the king's primary focus is on building a defensive line along the Danube and reforming his army. Meanwhile, Bela's main rival for the titles of the extinct Babenberg dynasty, Wenceslaus the One-Eyed, King of Bohemia, smartly takes advantage of the succession crisis in Austria. He arranges a marriage between his eldest son and heir, Vladislaus, and the last duke's niece, Gertrude of Babenberg. However, the marriage comes to an end when the 20-year-old Vladislaus dies suddenly, just 6 months later. To further her claim, Gertrude in turn marries Hermann VI, Margrave of Baden. But her new husband is rejected by the Austrian nobility and cannot establish his rule. Wenceslaus uses this interference as pretext to march into Austria, invited by the nobility to restore order after Hermann's death in 1250. But to acquire legitimacy to rule over the duchy, the king must turn to his other less favorable son, Ottokar, whom he imprisoned for leading a rebellion against the crown a few years earlier. To say that the king doesn't fancy the boy would be an understatement, but as his only living heir, the 18-year-old prince is important for Wenceslaus's political goals. Conveniently, the father and son reconcile and Ottokar is released from prison. Within weeks, his title of Margrave of Moravia is reinstated. With much pomp, he then travels to Vienna, where he marries the late Duke Frederick's sister, the 48-year-old Margaret of Babenberg. That she is 30 years older than him, reputedly ugly and cannot bear children, doesn't bother Ottokar in the slightest, for all he wants is the claim to her late brother's titles. With the marriage sealed, he receives support of the nobility and is proclaimed Duke of Austria and Styria. Now, ruled by the House of Przemyslid, Bohemia has become one of the most powerful players in Europe. This consolidation of power is a major victory for Wenceslaus, but the king does not get to enjoy it for long. He dies just a year later, aged 48. Ottokar succeeds his father as King of Bohemia with full support of the nobility. Using his newfound power and prestige, he seeks to expand his influence on the imperial stage. At this time, Bohemia is part of the Holy Roman Empire, an amalgamation of dozens of baronies, bishoprics, counties, fiefs, duchies, and kingdoms, nominally ruled by an elected emperor with the Pope's blessing. But with the death of Frederick II of Hohenstaufen in 1250, the succession of the Holy Roman Empire becomes contested between the pro- and anti-Hohenstaufen factions. This grows into a crisis that will last for over 20 years, known to us as the Great Interregnum, during which various claimants vie for power. In 1254, one such claimant is none other than the ambitious 21-year-old Ottokar. He mounts a bid for the imperial throne, relying on his mother tracing her lineage to the Hohenstaufen family, which by this time has dominated imperial politics for around 100 years. But his election bid fails to impress the prince-electors, most of whom recognize Count William II of Holland, fearing Ottokar's growing power. Although William dies just 2 years later in 1256, Ottokar does not press the issue further. Not wanting to over-leverage his position, he wisely cools his interest in the imperial throne for the time being, leaving room for other claimants to pursue their own bids, chiefly Alfonso of Castile and Richard of Cornwall. You see, while this was technically an election, it was only won by those with enough wealth and connections. Alfonso of Castile was the great-grandson of Frederick Barbarossa, thus tracing his lineage to the Hohenstaufen dynasty. Richard of Cornwall, the Plantagenet Prince of England, was the nephew of the late Otto IV, Holy Roman Emperor of the House of Wealth. But even though they traced their lineages to these imperial dynasties, both men were considered foreigners. Still, Richard used his vast wealth to bribe 4 of the 7 electors, including Ottokar, thereby gaining a simple majority. But despite becoming king of the Romans in 1257, his status as a foreigner means that he holds no real power in Germany, and thus has very little chance of becoming Holy Roman Emperor. While Ottokar's own bid failed, this balance of power suits him, for without a strong imperial figure, he can continue expanding his influence and make another attempt at the imperial throne at a later date. But the power, wealth, and ambition of the young 24-year-old King of Bohemia alarms neighboring rulers, none more so than King Bela, who finally decides to intervene in Austria and Styria. By now, the danger of a second Mongol invasion has diminished, so Bela calls upon his allies from the Kingdom of Ruthenia and Poland to send troops in support of his raids of Moravian and Austrian territories throughout the mid-1250s in an effort to weaken Ottokar's authority. To prevent an all-out war, Pope Innocent IV intervenes to mediate a peace treaty. It is agreed that Ottokar cede Styria to Hungary, in exchange for getting recognition of his right to rule Austria. King Bela, however, faces a rebellion in Styria. The local lords rise against Hungarian rule and expel their governor in 1258. Bela promptly invades Styria to restore his suzerainty. After subduing the rebels, the king appoints his eldest son Stephen as Duke of Styria. Stephen immediately launches a punitive raid into Carinthia to punish Duke Ulrich III for supporting the Styrian rebels. But the raid, meant to dissuade others from interfering in Styria, only makes Hungarian rule more unpopular within the duchy. Eventually in 1260, the local lords rebel again, probably aided by Ottokar, and Stephen is forced to flee back to Hungary. Endorsed by the Styrian nobility, the King of Bohemia reclaims the disputed territory he ceded 6 years earlier. He knows that his actions will start a war for control of the duchies of Austria and Styria, but he is ready. Ottokar has been preparing for a conflict for some time and has 30,000 troops under his command, including allies from Silesia, Carinthia, Carniola, and Brandenburg. A response from Bela would not be long in coming. Aided by his allies in Poland and Ruthenia, along with a contingent of Kuman riders, the King of Hungary amasses a 35,000-strong army and marches into Moravia. The two armies converge just 15 kilometers northwest of Pressburg. By mid-July 1260, Ottokar and Bela encamp on the opposite banks of the Morava. With the river posing a major obstacle, clearly whoever dared to cross first would find himself at a significant disadvantage. Neither commander would make the first move. After several days, the standoff begins to take its toll on the men, exposed to the heat and with ever-growing risk of disease. Ottokar proposes a battle on equal terms. Bela agrees. A 2-day truce is agreed to allow time for the troops to redeploy, and with that, the army of the Bohemian king begins moving away from the riverbank to let the Hungarians cross. After all, Bela has forested terrain to his rear and would not be able to make room for the Bohemians to cross to the eastern riverbank, while Ottokar has open fields to his west where they can do battle in the chivalric way. The next day, with the redeployment and moving of the camp still in progress, elements of the Bohemian rear guard, tasked with gathering provisions, clash with the Kuman light cavalry contingent of the Hungarian vanguard, commanded by Prince Stephen. Sources have opposing views on who broke the truce, but it is likely that the nomadic Kuman riders used the opportunity to strike the unprepared enemy. Whatever the case, by now Stephen commits to the fight, while much of the Hungarian army is still wading through water to cross the river. Closest to the action is Jarosz of Padehus, the governor of Prague Castle and commander of the heavy Czech knights, called the Iron Lords, likely the most elite unit on the battlefield. King Bela, assuming that his son is ambushed, leaps into action with his retinue and gathers more men who had by now crossed the river. The rest of the Hungarian army hurriedly continues to cross the river to join the fight. Ottokar receives word that his rear guard is engaged. Thinking that the Hungarians broke the truce, he musters all available troops and riders to meet the enemy. Meanwhile, the frontal attack of the Iron Lords repels the light Kuman cavalry. Soon, Stephen is pushed back and in a fight for his life. As Bela and his heavy cavalry join the fray to aid his son, what was until now a skirmish becomes a pitched battle. But the contest quickly proves uneven. With only a third of his army present, Bela faces almost the entire Bohemian army. Ottokar steams through the Hungarian ranks, driving back their entire line. Breaking under pressure, the Kumans flee towards the crossing point. Bela and his son Stephen attempt to maintain order, but are soon forced to make a hasty retreat. The pursuit is particularly brutal. Ottokar and his cavalry hack and trample over the Hungarian nobles and ordinary soldiers alike. While Bela successfully reaches the Morava, his son Stephen barely makes it out alive, with most of his retinue falling in battle. Hungarians still grouping near the river are caught unprepared and out of formation, and now a stampede of their own brothers in arms smashes into them. Such is their desperation to escape. In the carnage, around 10,000 of Biela's troops perish, as Ottokar runs them down and pushes the Hungarian army back across the Morava. Ottokar's crushing victory earns him the nickname the Iron King. He proceeds to chase the scattered Hungarian army to Pressburg, where he forces Biela to sign an unfavourable peace treaty. Firstly, with papal approval, Ottokar divorces the elderly Margaret of Babenberg and seals the peace agreement by marrying Biela's young granddaughter, Kunigunde, a political marriage meant to secure his kingdom's eastern border and provide him with an heir. Secondly, with the veiled threat of seizing the city of Pressburg and attacking Hungary proper, Ottokar forces Biela to cede Styria. And in a true power move, he has his claims to Austria and Styria formally recognized by Richard of Cornwall, whom he supported in his election to King of the Romans just 3 years before. Now, with Hungary cowed and the full acquisition of the Babenberg heritage, Ottokar becomes one of the most influential rulers in Europe. Over the next 11 years, he oversees a period of further expansion and consolidation of power. In 1266, he occupies the Egerland in northwest Bohemia. Then in 1268, Ottokar engineers a massive territorial expansion. He signs a contract of inheritance with Ulrich III, the last Carinthian duke of the House of Sponheim, thereby acquiring Carinthia, the March of Carniola, and the Wendish March, and incorporating Friuli into his kingdom in 1272. Ottokar is at the height of his power, and Bohemia takes center stage in European politics. Major legal reforms follow. Subjects are freed from feudal obligations, except for rent or tax, if such was levied. Free subjects could now also buy, sell, and inherit estates. These changes in the legal framework kickstart the development of prosperous land-owning villages and towns across the kingdom, thus strengthening the Bohemian economy from within. Law is introduced to allow Jews to become eligible for various high office positions, such as servant of the crown. Moreover, instead of being limited to seeking support only from their local lord, the Jews could now claim support of any royal official in the land. These systemic changes are followed with the building of fortifications across the kingdom. Zwickau Castle, Krivoklad Castle, and Bezdes Castle, to name a few. Ottokar also builds the famous Hofburg Palace in Vienna, which would later become the imperial palace of the Habsburg family. Moreover, the king mandates that his vassals build castles as well, a true sign of the rising strength of Bohemia. But then things come to a head. In 1272, several key figures on the continent meet their demise, reshuffling the cards of European politics once more. In Hungary, both Biela and Stephen are dead, and the throne passes to Stephen's son, Ladislaus IV. But, more importantly, Richard of Cornwall, the nominal king of the Romans, dies after a massive stroke, aged 63. This is the moment that Ottokar was waiting for. With his political and territorial influence, he is a major candidate for the imperial throne. But unfortunately for Ottokar, by now the prince-electors have started to fear him. The Bohemian king simply became too strong. If elected, he could take control of the whole empire. And so, overwhelming opposition is mounted to prevent his election. The prince-electors settle on a minor count from Swabia, a certain Rudolf of Habsburg. At the ripe age of 55, he's seen as an old man of no consequence and is thought of as the safest choice, for he lacks the strength and capability of Ottokar and could be easily controlled. Most importantly, a weak ruler like Rudolf would be unable to contest the disputed imperial fiefs claimed by men like Ottokar, thus preserving the empire from further internal conflict caused by the interregnum. But the prince-electors are wrong about the new king of the Romans. Unbeknownst to them, Rudolf, despite his old age and low-tier noble status, is not the meek figurehead they were looking for, but one of the most brilliant political minds of his time. His crowning in Aachen Cathedral on 24th of October 1273 ends the great interregnum in the Holy Roman Empire. It doesn't escape Rudolf that he was chosen precisely because the prince-electors fear the immensely powerful Ottokar. But instead of appeasing the king of Bohemia, Rudolf realizes that if he plays his cards right, he can rally support against Ottokar and expand his own power at Bohemia's expense. A move so bold that all other prince-electors combined dared not take in prior years. In a masterful 2-year game of diplomacy, perhaps his strongest skill, Rudolf strengthens his position in the classic Habsburg style: marriages. Knowing exactly which buttons to push and what promises to make, he forms a vast alliance between 1273 and 1275, an alliance strong enough to counter Bohemia. In addition, to win the support of the Pope, Rudolf renounces all imperial rights in Rome, the papal territory, and Sicily. And to sweeten the deal, he promises to lead a new crusade. Pope Gregory X, in turn, persuades Alfonso of Castile, another claimant to the imperial throne, to throw his support behind Rudolf as well. With his legitimacy strengthened, the Habsburg emperor decides that now is the time to make his move against Ottokar. In January 1275, Rudolf holds a Reichstag in Würzburg. There he declares his intent to use the imperial authority to reclaim the alienated fiefs for the realm, primarily hinting at the duchies of Styria and Carinthia. To resolve the matter, Ottokar is summoned to Würzburg. But Ottokar, who was not present during Rudolf's election, does not recognize him as king and refuses to answer the summons. Doing otherwise would mean the return of the conquered duchies, because the Diet at Würzburg is clearly stacked against him, which would leave him with just Bohemia and Moravia. In his absence, an imperial ban is placed on Ottokar, and Rudolf declares war on the Bohemian king. A joint imperial and Hungarian army besieges Ottokar at Vienna, while a revolt of disenfranchised nobles, who are angry about Ottokar's economic reforms, erupts in Bohemia. Backed into a corner, the king is effectively forced to accept Rudolf's terms at the point of a sword. He cedes the 4 provinces to the imperial administration in November 1276, and receives only Bohemia and Moravia as a fief. But although Ottokar accepts Rudolf as his overlord, this acceptance is nothing more than lip service. He spends the next year and a half amassing a coalition of allies and mercenaries to fight his cause. And by the campaigning season of 1278, he is ready to embark on the campaign to retake what he believes is his rightful claim. Ottokar's diplomatic offensive had been a success, and Siegfried, Duke of Lower Bavaria, switched sides and supplied an army for his use. Ottokar ordered that Siegfried remain in Bavaria and provide a block on the advance of Rudolf's allies marching south. Most pertinently, the forces of Ludwig II, Duke of Upper Bavaria, as well as those of Frederick III of Nuremberg and Rudolf's Swabian contingents. Brandenburg and Silesia also joined Ottokar's cause, but his most capable allies were those of Lesser Poland, who provided him with a very potent heavy cavalry arm. While these forces were assembling, Ottokar moved against Rosendorf, capturing it in a siege that lasted a little over 2 weeks, and then moving on to invest La Andataya while waiting for more of his force to arrive. His army eventually swells to 30,000 men, a truly imperial-sized force for the era. Rudolf, however, is not idle. Unsatisfied with waiting for his allies and Ottokar to arrive at Vienna, he strikes his camp there, likely in the early weeks of August, and sends word that he will take position on the Marchfeld near Stilfried. Meanwhile, Siegfried's blockade of Lower Bavaria proves ineffective, and Rudolf's contingents are able to pass through and continue towards the meeting place on the Marchfeld. Even more ominously for Ottokar, Ladislaus of Hungary joins the imperial army, leading a force that includes 5,000 Cumans, who are expert riders and lethal horse archers. Learning of this growing enemy force, Ottokar disengages from his siege and moves with his own host to meet Rudolf in the field. Having had a chance to scout the area before Ottokar's arrival, Rudolf chooses to move once more, taking up position this time nearer to Dunkreut. There, in the last week of August, the armies of the two kings come face to face to decide the fate of the Holy Roman Empire. Rudolf has selected a wide flat plain between the Morava River and the settlements of Weidendorf and Dunkreut. Ottokar and his forces are to the northeast, seemingly based around the road running through Seendorf and alongside Jedenspeigen. Interestingly, both commanders leave their infantry behind to guard the camps and advance to engage with only their mounted forces. Ottokar has the advantage here, fielding perhaps 6,500 heavy knights, a tremendous force, and placing them in 3 main companies, each divided into 2 battles for better maneuverability and ease of command. Rudolf's formation mirrors that of Ottokar's, but with one alteration. Instead of placing his heavy cavalry at the front, he orders that they be kept in the rear, out of sight of the Bohemian king and his captains. The sight that greets Ottokar on the morning of the battle, then, is one of a lightly armoured but still numerous force. Thousands of mounted warriors, but nothing to match the grandeur of his own battle-hardened, armoured contingents. Rudolf himself takes his place amongst a contingent of heavy cavalry at the centre, and Ottokar does the same. Neither side is reticent about moving forward. However, the Bohemian and Polish knights of Ottokar find that their charge is impeded by the Cumans of Ladislaus, who move forward and strafe the enemy lines with arrows. Thousands of arrows sail into the Bohemian lines, causing grievous wounds and terrible consternation to even veteran noble fighters. Moving in and out from the wings of Rudolf's army, the Cumans are too fast for the heavy knights to pursue, and they also have the advantage of range, so that Ottokar's ranks cannot reply with their own missiles. Alongside the frustration and the rage felt at the relentless waves of arrows, the heat of the August day is beginning to affect the engaged lines of Ottokar's cavalry companies. Constantly having to take shelter under their shields and then chasing the contemptible Cumans has brought their ire to a feverish pitch. Finally, Ottokar orders the charge. On seeing the raised flags and hearing the trumpets ringing over the plain, Rudolf orders his own front companies to ride and meet the enemy. The moments that follow are of the most fraught in many the men's lives. Everything else is forgotten except the outline of the horsemen in front of them. While the sun glints off lance and helm, the riverbank shakes, the water of the Morava River quivering from the impact of the horses and their riders. Waves of arrows fly overhead, mostly in the direction of Ottokar's lines, the Cumans guarding the flanks of Rudolf's army and funneling them toward the center where the king awaits. The impact is tremendous, and the far greater weight of the collision is felt by the Habsburg forces. Their heavy cavalry is far outnumbered by the Bohemians and Poles. But crucially, Rudolf's line holds, and the fighting with lance, spear, sword, and mace rages like a bloody inferno. For Ottokar, everything is going to plan. He and his troops have endured and prevailed through the ordeal of the Cuman arrow storm, and though the Cumans continue to fire into his flanks, it is a matter of time until his heavy cavalry plows through the fragile Habsburg line. Rudolf, in the midst of his own front line, fights with the resilience he expects of his men, calling out to them to stand fast, wade into the enemy, and trust in God that He will deliver their cause and allow them to prevail. It is not enough. There is not the strength in the Habsburg force to shrug off the heavy cavalry, and Ottokar's host steadily gains ground. In one of the flurries of commotion that erupts in the midst of a grinding attritional battle, Rudolf's horse is killed underneath him, and the first Habsburg is thrown to the ground and forced to cover himself with his shield to avoid a killing blow. It is a moment in which history itself holds its breath. Should Rudolf fall in this moment, the future of Europe as we know it is open to question. But fate did not decree such a fortune that day. Rudolf's bodyguard and knights put themselves between their king and his enemies, fighting desperately to protect him, while others grasp him by the armor and limbs and pull him back to safety. Ottokar senses weakness. Blood is in the water, and he cries out for his men to fight all the hard. The Habsburg line falls back further. Yet this is the moment that Rudolf himself has been waiting for. When Ottokar reaches the mark, a trumpet sounds away to his right, and before anyone on his side can react, a heavy cavalry force of knights streams from their concealed spot amidst the trees and hills. The ambush party crashes into Ottokar's right flank, throwing it off and dealing such damage that his second wing is now as impaired as the left. Seeing this and fuming at the deceit, Ottokar orders that his units at the rear wheel around and counterattack. The maneuver is completed, but in the fog of the battle, its operation is disjointed and unsynchronized. Seeing the reserve ranks of the enemy turning about, Rudolf's men began to shout, "They are running! They are running!" The frontline knights of Ottokar's host turn, and from their perspective it does seem that their comrades are abandoning them. They began to waver, and at this moment Rudolf launches his second hidden weapon. His own reserve of heavy cavalry, hitherto concealed at the rear and out of sight of Ottokar's force, charges and slams into the already vulnerable center of the Bohemian army. Tired and parched from fighting against the lighter units, as well as withstanding the Cuman arrows, the combined onslaught of the fresh heavy cavalry, and with the apparent disappearance of their reserve, causes Ottokar's center companies to implode. Those that can turn and run. Others fight on, but they pay the ultimate price, Ottokar among them. His body is later recovered from the field and put prominently on display by the victorious Rudolf. To exacerbate his panicked troops' misery, the Imperial Army and especially the Cumans pursue the Bohemians and Poles from the field and beyond, hunting down any survivors unlucky to fall into their hands before they can reach safety. At one point, Ottokar was the most serious contender for the imperial throne, but after his demise in the Battle of Marchfeld, for the first time a Habsburg stood uncontested as the Holy Roman Emperor. Rudolf took over as Duke of Austria, a title his dynasty will hold for 640 years, until they are brought down by the catastrophe of the First World War. The Battle of Marchfeld is often viewed as the turning point in world history and the birth of Habsburg domination. Rudolf spent the latter years of his reign consolidating his hold on Ottokar's former territories, as well as expanding Habsburg influence in Switzerland. Thanks to him, the House of Habsburg becomes the most powerful dynasty in the Holy Roman Empire. In many ways, Rudolf came along at the perfect time to usher in the era of Habsburg dominance, and at the worst time for Ottokar, who was on the cusp of establishing the Premyslids as the preeminent dynasty on the continent. Had Ottokar been able to overcome the challenges posed by Rudolf, the future of Europe might have been very different. If you like what you see, consider supporting my work on Patreon, and you get ad-free early access to my videos for as little as $1. You can also show your support by liking the video, commenting, and subscribing to my channel as a sacrifice to the algorithm. As always, I'll see you in the next one.